I've always found history incredibly fascinating for one very, very important reason, and that reason is this. Because human nature never really changes, history often repeats itself in remarkably similar ways. We're going to talk about that today when we discuss what I call the end of the Greater Gilded Age. You're going to want to stick around for this because, well, there's implications and there's also fascination to be had here with some of the wildest American history that there ever was and that we've just lived through. Let's get into it this morning. And a very good morning to all of you. I know many of you are basking in terribly cold weather throughout much of the United States, and I'm kind of shocked to see how this cold wave has come through and how persistent it's going to be for at least the next 10 days. It really harkens back to more times in the old days, so to speak, when winter seemed to be colder and that snow would pile up. And in Dickens' London, everybody would be freezing to death and everything that. But it also always seems to be an accompanying sideshow to economic history. In other words, the weather seems to get worse at the very time that people can least afford to have it get worse, whether it's persistent droughts or excessive heat or excessive cold. But you didn't tune in to hear that today, but I call this period that we're wrapping up and exiting now the Greater Gilded Age, and I contrast that to what was the original Gilded Age from about 1870 after the Civil War till about 1900 and the election of 1896, 1900 with the election of William McKinley, maybe a little bleed over to about 1910. That was a period in America, particularly when industrial expansion was booming, railroads and things like that. And if I had to use one word to describe this Gilded Age of America at that particular time, it was scale. And because of the massive scale of manufacturing, because of the massive increase in output, society eventually had a very difficult time adjusting to the consumption of this sudden explosive rise in scale, being able to produce. Remember, through the early industrial age, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, through the Civil War, craft industries were still very much a thing. Individual cobblers knew how to make shoes, and furniture makers would do things on a scale that some 20 years later was unimaginable. As large factory layouts brought huge increases in the amount of goods that could be produced per man hour per day. And the trick was to get that cost per unit as low as possible by having the greatest productive output of all. You can make a smaller profit on a greater number of units than a larger profit on a few guild-produced units. Big difference. But that had all kinds of implications for working class people because, well, all of a sudden with industry changing the whole way and becoming more reaching maturity, you need to have much more labor in the process of production. And, well, it explains one thing, why there was this amazing push in the 1880s, post-Civil War, to have a huge influx of immigration. Remember that, the Irish coming over after the famine, serving in the Civil War, and then going into the industries, carpentry and things and building trades and things like that. Then the Germans came over, and the Eastern European immigrants, and the Chinese and the Japanese. It was phenomenal, right? The amount of labor that was needed at that particular time to scale up and to build the industrial output that characterized, well, the first boom industrial age of the Gilded Age from about 1867 till about 1907, we'll call it. Again, a very interesting period. Well, it was also a period where wealth was super accumulated. This huge scale could often be attributed to one person having a great idea, whether it was Cornelius Vanderbilt to consolidate railroads, or Andrew Carnegie immigrating from Scotland and deciding to get into the steel business and then building the largest steel conglomerate the world had ever known. It often seemed to be one individual, whether it was in banking with J.P. Morgan, industry, Charles Frick, Charles Schwab, all of these individual companies that went on to achieve great success, and their owners achieve massive wealth. That's why they called that the Gilded Age at that particular time. Mark Twain coined that term because, well, things look gilded. And if you know anything about gold gilding on picture frames and things like that, it's a very thin layer of gold that you just brush over top of a picture frame. And, well, it looks like it's solid gold, but it's crappy wood, right? Cheap wood with just this really thin layer of gold leaf on top of it. Well, in Mark Twain's estimation, American society had become that in this first really major industrial boom. It looked beautiful on the outside with the gilt of all the, I don't want to call them robber barons, but the earliest really industrial giants here that made fortunes, lived lives that were totally unknown before in America, and particularly unrelatable to the average citizen in the country. Well, you can imagine this dichotomy over time, this two-ness of the universe of the United States began to irritate people because, well, the rich got richer, and at no time in history until the present had wealth been concentrated into so few hands. When Mrs. Vanderbilt decided to give a party in the 1880s, early 1890s. She was able to draw together a list of about 400 important people in America that she wanted to have at her party. And she did a pretty good job in then unknowingly identifying exactly what the situation was with the Gilded Age. There was the 400 elites, right? Then there was the rest of us. And this spread between wealth at the top and living standards and people just getting by at the bottom was absolutely tremendous. So one thing that the United States government did was open the floodgates of immigration. Few people think back to that now because we're living through the current legal and illegal immigration struggles at the current time. But back then, a lot of the same struggles happened. And the same attitudes, the same anger was visited on immigrations, and it just seemed to no end because you could not raise the wage scale in the factories and things like that. And because you could not do that, because there was always 400, 500 guys standing around the outside of the gates of the factory, ready to go in as soon as you keeled over or just couldn't make the quota anymore. Well, there's guys ready to come in and take your job. That's what the surplus of labor did at that particular time. It made work basically a means to just survive. And it was very, very difficult to get ahead. And as a result, there was a lot of friction began to develop between working people and management. But as I say, with the number of people waiting outside for jobs, well, it became a point of, usually you just had to suck it up and deal with it. If you ever read Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, about meatpacking and the lives of people in Chicago around that particular time, it's a pretty bleak time. And a lot of families to survive ended up having to put the wife to work and even the kids to go trundling off to work. Even 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds get out there and sell newspapers and into the factories. Why? Because just making it, just being able to pay the rent was just vicious to find something affordable, to find some type of food to just sustain and keep people going. It was not a happy time. Okay, talk about a dog-eat-dog existence. And it has a lot of eerie similarities to today, where people feel like they're just on a treadmill and putting more and more human capital, right, labor into the marketplace just to survive. Well, if you're a robber baron at that particular time, everything's gravy, right? You have a huge and expanding labor pool. You never have to worry about labor shortages or things like that. But as with many other trends that seem unstoppable, the Gilded Age came to a dramatic end in 1893 with the worst depression in the history of America, and one sadly in our historical mind, way overshadowed by the crash of '29 and the Great Depression that followed in the 1930s. But back then, the railroads, due to overexpansion, started to fail, and a major manufacturer of rope and cordage went bankrupt. It was a huge employer in the United States. And before long, unemployment skyrocketed to 19%. And there were some things that happened, we'll get into in a minute, that were very dangerous for the continued financial existence of the United States, because there was no Federal Reserve or ultimate authority. It bears noting that Grover Cleveland was the president through much of this, and he's the only president that was ever elected to 2 non-consecutive terms until Donald Trump was re-elected in 2024. Strangely enough, Grover Cleveland actually won the popular vote in 3 elections, but in the middle sandwich election, he lost to William Harrison, who won the electoral vote through what they claim was some flim-flamming and all that. Grover Cleveland, incidentally, was also the first Democrat president to be elected since the Civil War, quite a feat in itself. And as another interesting aside, his daughter Ruth was who the Baby Ruth candy bar was named after, not Babe Ruth. But Grover Cleveland called her Baby Ruth, and unfortunately she died of diphtheria at 12 years old, greatly saddening the family. Cleveland was also the only president to ever be married in the White House, and also had, or so the news accounts said, fathered an illegitimate child. We don't really know. He was the son of a minister in Caldwell, New Jersey there. I mean, you hear all kinds of things. But let's not get too far off track, but I hope that you're finding this fascinating. And if you are, please take a second to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and the like button. Well, here we are in history. In the 1890s are unfolding. Here begins this terrible depression. And people's lives that were already lousy to begin with, and so far removed from the strata of high society, just got pushed down another peg. And it became worse and worse, and destitution on the streets. And at that time, the only thing that there was really around was charities and churches and things like that to take care of people. It was a very bitter time. And it cost Grover Cleveland another election, or actually he didn't even decide to run again in 1896, because the public was so against him and so embittered that it hastened in the beginning of the Republican administration, tariffs and things like that under President William McKinley. The Gilded Age evaporated because a lot of this wealth, the stock market took a terrific hit during this depression of 1893, and a lot of this opulent wealth disappeared. And then by the time Teddy Roosevelt came into office, who was a real reformer in every true sense of the word, a lot of this corruption and a lot of these terrible monopolistic business practices and trusts were explored and dissected and taken apart, and people understood that actually, although competition is good, my competitor is really my friend when I can cooperate with him to keep prices high. That's a beautiful arrangement. My competitor is my friend. Well, that dominated so much of the Gilded Age. And over time, as the Depression faded and people went back to work, there was this sense that there was more changes that were taking place. You had Jane Addams in Hull House in New York, and housing advocates, and she worked Chicago too. There were advocates that were starting to advocate for better housing. People were just basically living in slum conditions. Better food, clean up the food industry. I don't even want to tell you some of the things in Upton Sinclair's novel, maybe sensationalized to a great extent, but a lot of that stuff went in on the industry. Milk would be tainted to make it cheap, and sickness was just endemic at that particular time, because industry and commerce and corporations were just running truly unfettered with no particular restraints on them at all. If we fast forward to this Gilded Age, what I call the Greater Gilded Age, we see some remarkable similarities. We can name a handful of maybe 5, 10 super wealthy individuals that have tremendous control and wealth. From the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, the members of the Walton family of Walmart fame, people like Warren Buffett. There's just people, chairmen of some of these high technology companies. They have wealth. Zuckerberg and all these people in Google, they have wealth on an untoward scale, which is why why I choose to call it the Greater Gilded Age. And it's coming to an end now, because things are the distance between those top echelons of wealth and the average working person today are absolutely phenomenal. Housing is more expensive, food is more expensive, insurance is more expensive, entertainment is more expensive, even going to a sporting game is more. Everything has become elitist, and people are like a rubber band. They can only be stretched so far before things pop, and I'm afraid we may be at that position now, exactly lining up with our second president that's serving non-consecutive terms coming up. And I sometimes wonder if his presidency will end the way that Grover Cleveland's did, in kind of just a shake of the head and glad to see you go, don't let the door hit you on the way out. There will be a period of tremendous readjustment coming up here in America. This Gilded Age, which looks beautiful for the super wealthy in so many ways, and remember, the average person used to love to watch that, the right lifestyles of the rich and famous, and great California real estate in the Hamptons in New York, and the Chicago super wealthy posh suburbs. Well, you don't see that too much anymore, because people are the super wealthy are starting to put their heads down in the holes so they don't get whacked coming up. But I can guarantee you, with the struggles that are going on with the rest of America right now, it augurs for real change that will be coming up, and maybe not the most smooth type of change too. I would expect that we'll have great bouts of civil unrest and problems here coming up in the future, because right now we have employment where everybody's struggling, working 2 or 3 jobs, and mentally just about had it to drop dead on the treadmill, keeping going. And when the treadmill finally stops for a period of time and people are thrown out of work in massive numbers, and remember, AI is the great interrupter of that, just like the Industrial Revolution was in the 1830s and 40s, right? We have another huge thing today that threatens to put an end to the Gilded Age. Fortunes will be lost and new fortunes will be made in the future too, as we attempt to navigate this. But isn't it amazing how everything is aligned, that we have a non-consecutive two-term president, just like we had in the 1890s. We have the potential for a severe economic contraction coming up here, just like in the 1890s. And we have the greatest difference between the wealthy, super wealthy, and the rest of America that we've had since the Gilded Age. Who says history doesn't repeat itself? Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the end of the Greater Gilded, what I call the term, the Greater Gilded Age here. I think it's fascinating when you think how things conspire to build themselves up. We'll have many more of these discussions coming up, and I hope that you are enjoying and getting something out of it. If you are, could I ask you to share it out to family and friends? Forewarned is forearmed. It's better to go into the future with your eyes wide open than looking backwards with your eyes behind you and getting hit in the front by a freight train, okay? Fascinating times for sure. Once again, please hit that bell for all notifications, subscribe, and thanks for tapping that like button. And let me know your comments down below about the Greater Gilded Age. Thanks, everybody.